Dr. McCawley, you, I believe, are from West Virginia. So what brings you to Montrose this week?
Well, I was asked to come up by the Breathe Easy folks to take a look at the hydrofracturing operations that were going on, Marcellus shale drilling operations. I have done a study in West Virginia for the state legislature there of Marcellus shale drilling operations, looking at air emissions and noise emissions, and they wanted to know how I thought what was going on up here compared to the operations I had seen down there in West Virginia. Okay,
and you made recommendations to the legislature?
I did make recommendations to the legislature on how that should be controlled. The original idea behind doing the study in West Virginia was to look at what they call setback distance. The legislature had required a 625-foot setback. That is the distance from the center of the well pad to any sensitive location, such as a house, a school, a hospital, an office building, anything like that. And they wanted to know whether they thought that was sufficient for people to not be overexposed. The finding was, in fact, that the 625-foot distance was not sufficient and actually not really very predictive of what would go on. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation because the concentration, certainly of the air pollution, depends upon the meteorology, the weather at the location, as well as the terrain at the location. So something that's up on top of a mountain is probably going to be more diluted by high winds than something that sits down in a closed valley.
So a hard, fast distance or number in a piece of legislation or a state regulation really is not the way to go?
That's not the way to go. It's not a one-size-fits-all. What I suggested instead was something that they actually had been using all along with the chemical industry in Charleston, the state capital. That is, they do what they call fence line sampling. Put a sampler at the boundary of the plant and look at what the concentration is that occurs right there. It's a more localized value because a lot of the situations are really localized situations. These are not things that have huge smokestacks that spew pollution far and wide in the countryside. Whatever is coming from these operations are really more localized in their concentration. And so in addition to having a localized monitor, I suggested that they could do it in a real-time situation so that you could see what was actually happening in real time. And in fact, that allows the operator to have control, better control of the situations because they'll know what's going on. They'll know if they're making a lot of noise or they'll know if they're emitting a lot of pollution into the air, and they can adjust what they're doing.
So the technology exists, if you will, to make this site-specific and then make appropriate adjustments depending on the circumstances?
That's right. The technology now exists. One of the big breakthroughs was in radio transmission technology. So your old wireless base phone that you used to have in the house before you got a cell phone, that was a radio transmitter. And the radio transmitters now are capable of broadcasting line of sight to about 14 miles with very low power and a very low profile. These are small units that can fit with whatever you've got, and a low cost as well.
Well, that's my next question. Is it cost effective?
Yeah, I think it's very cost effective. While the equipment that you might place a given location is going to be expensive, and there we're talking in the tens of thousands of dollars, the equipment can be moved from location to location as you drill one well pad and the next well pad and the next well pad. So over the cost of perhaps the first 20 or 30 well pads, if you divide those tens of thousands of dollars by 20, you're talking about hundreds of dollars suddenly. And so that cost is relatively minor compared to any of the other costs at the well site.
Now, how has the industry responded to your recommendations?
In West Virginia, they seem to be in favor of it because they really did not like the setback distance concept. possibly for a different reason than the one I pointed out, because it would have required them to go much larger distances between where they were drilling. And so anything that could do away with the setback distance, as this could, seemed to be met favorably. And the same thing was true of the environmental groups that I met with. So they both seemed to like it, and when I mentioned it to the legislature, as I did, I was actually asked to come and report directly to the legislature on this. Both sides seem to be very happy with that solution.
Okay, so in all of this controversy here, we have maybe a win-win situation for a change?
We do. For a change, it's a win-win situation. And my background is both engineering and public health. And as an engineer, I like to come up with solutions that work. And that's what I want to do, have a solution that I can say to someone, well, here's the right thing to do. And I know in talking to friends of mine who are engineers, and in fact, actually, some of my former engineering students are now in charge of operating some of these wells. And I think I've taught them fairly well what their responsibility to their community is. And I think a lot of them really want to meet that responsibility and feel that they have this oath that an engineer takes to do things. And because of that, if you know what the conditions are in the operation that you're running, you can run a better operation. That saves you money in the long run. It saves you money also because you're not fighting battles over who said what or who did what. We also recommended to the legislature that, in fact, the data, as it was being generated, should be open to everyone so that it's transparent. No one says, oh, they're doing this behind our back or they're doing that behind our back, when, in fact, you can see the data, you can see what's going on. So it hopefully will inject a modicum of reliability and truth into everything that's going on, and not be a he said, she said.
Are these principles of this technology, is this applicable in other fields as well? Let's take coal, for example. Does your technology relate to anything other than natural gas?
Well, in fact, it can be used for a number of different monitoring situations. So if you want to monitor water quality, say coming out of a power plant, or if you want to monitor water quality downstream of some industry, or if you want to monitor air quality from some other location, all of these things are quite possible. Right now, the way we do air pollution monitoring is we find one location that may represent several thousand square miles and say, this is the value that represents all those thousands of square miles, where in fact there may be high concentrations in one area, low concentrations in another. So you can set up more localized systems that transmit and network together to give you a more accurate network for doing things.
You mentioned, obviously, your presentation was to the West Virginia legislature and well received. Politics being politics, however, what did they do with it? Did they actually implement it?
Well, they're in the process of implementing it. I helped to review the legislation they were writing, so I got to add my 2 cents into the legislation. So hopefully it will reflect the recommendations that I've made, but it's a slow process.
Right, it always is.
It always is.
Anything else about this that's important that we should know?
Well, one of the other things we're looking at with all of this is something called ultrafine particles. There are no regulations in the United States on ultrafine particles. The EPA has regulations for what they call PM10 and PM2.5. And what that refers to is the particulate matter, the dust coming from a system. And the 10 is 10 micrometers and less, and the 2.5 is 2.5 micrometers and less. And what's a micrometer? Well, human hair is about 100 micrometers in diameter, which gives you an idea as to how small these particles are. If you could stack 10 micrometer particles up across the diameter of human hair, that's really tiny. Well, the ultrafine particles are orders of magnitude smaller still. They're a tenth of a micrometer and less in size. And there's concern about the relative toxicity of the ultrafine particles, that they may in fact be a lot more toxic because of their size alone than the PM10 and the PM2.5. And the research that's been done on them has mostly been done by the Europeans because of the price of gasoline in Europe. They use a lot of diesels, and diesels generate a lot of these ultrafine particles. Also, when you have an ultrafine particle that's man-made for a particular purpose, it's not called ultrafine anymore, it's called a nanoparticle. So if you've heard about nanoparticles and concern about whether nanoparticles are toxic, it's the same thing with the ultrafines. And so we have seen operations in West Virginia, in the southern part of West Virginia, with mountaintop mining, where the ultrafine particle concentration was very high, and the suspicion is where you have these high concentrations, you'll see things like cancers, cardiovascular disease, heart disease, hypertension, high blood pressure, stroke. You'll see lung diseases, particularly in children, and particularly asthma in children. And those were the kind of symptoms we were seeing in that population, and it was the ultrafines that distinguished that population from the surrounding areas where the disease rates were not as high. And so when we started to look at some of the drilling operations, we're beginning to see places where there are high ultrafine particle concentrations as well. So we're a little bit worried that it first of all, is not controlled by the EPA here, and nobody monitors for it. So we're trying to do the monitoring and also trying to see whether, in fact, there is some health effect that may be associated with it in areas where the drilling occurs.
Now, this kind of research is I assume is expensive. Do you get funding from anybody?
We do get funding. We've had a lot of funding from the Department of Energy, continue to get funding from the Department of Energy. We're hoping to get some funding from the NIH. We've had discussions with some of their contracting officials who give out the grants. There's a lot more now being done on the ultrafines than was done even 4 or 5 years ago. So it seems to be getting some attention in the funding.